Good morning and afternoon, and welcome everyone on the East Coast and the West Coast, and everywhere beyond and in between. I'm Guillermo Gomez, Program Director at the Urban Design Forum. If you'd like to introduce yourself and where you're at, feel free to use the chat kind of throughout the event today. Thanks for tuning in today for the 7th event of our Shapeshift series. We launched our series in 2019, ready to shape a new plan for the city's design and development process under the next mayor. We organized discussions on the history of New York City's zoning code, the community planning process, and historic race-based planning policies and practices that created the spatial inequalities that exist today in the built environment. We also brought speakers from other cities to share new and big initiatives to shape equitable neighborhoods like our friends in Minneapolis and Los Angeles. Then 2020 hit. Coronavirus upended our lives, our city, and of course, the 2021 mayoral race. But the forum responded last year, led numerous initiatives to speak with other city leaders on their coronavirus responses, launched a community design initiative in the hardest hit neighborhoods in New York City, and led a discussion series on community development and ways to shape a just and economic recovery. We knew that shaping the next New York under the next mayor will need brilliant minds, a powerful plan, and transformational ideas. So throughout 2020, we got to work with nearly 50 of our forum fellows. Over 20 meetings, nearly 50 hours of discussions, our fellows advise us on the best directions our city must take in order to shape inclusive, equitable, and sustainable neighborhoods. If our advisors are tuning in today, we see you and we thank you greatly for sharing your knowledge and expertise this past year. In March of this year, the forum released 21 visions for 2021, a resource and call for action for New York City's next leadership, packed with policy proposals across 7 defining issues on the built environment. We offer ways to shape complete neighborhoods, make a call to lead in design excellence, urge better and ongoing community engagement through real civic infrastructure, create community tools to welcome good growth, establish a right to housing and combat segregation, reshape the city with a comprehensive climate strategy, and create working neighborhoods and access to jobs throughout the 5 boroughs. Our advisors, a multiracial, multi-generational group of professionals ranging in ages, industries, and backgrounds, map the current and systemic and future challenges in New York City's built environment. And we're lucky to have some of them join us on our call-in event today. We grounded our approach for 21 Visions in 3 things: racial equity, economic democracy, and climate action, with the pandemic informing us at every turn how to shape a better recovery. At the core, our 21 visions highlight the spatial injustices that have been magnified by the pandemic and offer better ways to plan and grow. In the coming weeks, leading up to the June 22nd primary, we want to center planning and design throughout the election cycle. We'll be hosting a series of discussions, inviting some of our advisors and forum fellows to point out big ideas for the next mayor. So we welcome you to explore our website, share our ideas, connect us with candidates running for mayor, city council, borough president, and comptroller. Today, our first event of our Shapeshift series in nearly, I think, a year or so, we point at some of the most important themes in our platform of 21 Visions. We hope is that the next mayor shapes long-term and ongoing community planning infrastructure to inform the way our city should grow, where to build new housing, create new jobs, build more parks, and increase transit. Numerous debates on the best approach are happening in real time today. Does New York City need a comprehensive plan? If so, what would it look like? We're very excited to launch our first event today with Seattle as a case study. We'll hear from Sam Assefa, the former director of Seattle's Office of Planning and Community Development as of a few weeks ago. We'll then have 3 respondents joining us, advisors from our Complete Neighborhoods Working Group, to help me get the conversation going. So throughout our discussion, we welcome questions in our Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window. If you share an inspiring question, we might be able to unmute you and ask your question live. So now I'd like to invite Sam to join us on screen.
Great, thanks Guillermo for—
Good morning, Sam.
Can you hear me? Good morning.
Yes. So we're catching you upon your exit from Seattle's Office of Planning and Community Development, where you were originally appointed in 2016. Prior, Sam served as senior urban designer for the city of Boulder, Colorado. From 2002 to 2010, he was also director of land use and planning policy at the Chicago Department of Planning and Development, and served also as deputy chief of staff to Mayor Daley. And between 1991 and 2002, Sam also worked as senior urban designer for San Francisco architecture firm SMWM, as well as the City of San Francisco Planning Department. Sam, we're so happy to have you join us here today, share your inspiring work in Seattle and the expertise you bring to the table from working across the country. We're excited to hear the work you led on Seattle's 2035 Comprehensive Plan and the unique Equitable Development Initiative. So I'll pass the podium and mic to you for your presentation. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you again, Guillermo, and thank you for the Urban Design Forum for inviting me here. This is a very important conversation, especially as you mentioned, after the pandemic, we really need to think about how we, as custodians of the land that we live in, play, and raise our children, and how we need to think about how we plan for our cities. So I am honored to join you here. So what I'll do is let me share my screen. And let's see, I will, beginning, great. So before I start, I just want to say that this is an important time. What I was going to cover is primarily sort of the high level context, planning context within Seattle, but specifically talk about how Seattle manages growth and how it's linked to the rest of the state. I'll talk, sort of give you an overview of the comprehensive plan, which really governs high-level policies for the city, how the city grows, and land use development, and then give some examples of the how the comp plan is implemented, is brought down from a 20,000 foot to the ground. Before I do that, I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming, from the land, the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish, past and present, who have been here thousands of years before us, and just pay gratitude that we are lucky enough to enjoy this land and be here and plan for its current and future as well. It is important to know, where the place came from, and acknowledge that as we really become custodians of the land for which we develop policies. So let me start just quickly about just giving you some Seattle basics. It is a stunning place in terms of the location, and sandwiched between Lake Washington and the Puget Sound to the west. It has a spectacular location, including the Cascade Mountains and the Olympic Mountains as well. The topography and waterways from a land use perspective obviously creates some challenges in terms of infrastructure, transportation, bridges, but it also has, as you can see from this image, very stunning natural beauty. So all of that has to be taken into account when we think about land use policies that will have significant impact for many years. Not as big as New York. We're only just about 142 square miles. Most of that is water. 84 square miles of that is land. And our population, obviously, it's almost the size of a borough in New York, but 761,000 estimate as of 2020. And currently, Seattle, a day before COVID, and I think it will continue, has been experiencing, significant growth, primarily driven by becoming a a tech hub of the country and the world as well. So Seattle is growing an incredible rate. But right from the beginning, throughout its history, Seattle has gone through, in its early stages, from the gold rush and a natural resources economy to a post-industrial powerhouse, and then today a technology and information hub globally in this current generation. So throughout its history and through these changes, Seattle has always reimagined itself through and its communities through its land use policies and land use decisions. So it's an important component of the city's DNA as it has gone through these transformative changes in very short times. That is even more true in the last 20 years. Just the day before COVID, Seattle was one of the fastest growing cities in the country. Significant more a number of cranes throughout the city, more than New York, LA, or any city in North America. Just in 10 years, between 2010 and 2020, the city experienced about 24% growth in population, 20% in housing, and just 30% in job growth. That is a significant increase in just 10 years. The city has about 20% of the US central office stock within the central business district. It is mind-boggling in terms of how fast and how quickly that grew. And the obvious, of course, leaders are most of the tech industries, Amazon being the poster child. The picture that you see is that of Amazon's headquarters, which has over 11 million square feet of office within the city. That is more than the next 25 to 28 companies combined, just in one company. So there has a lot of sort of envious, a lot of cities are envious or have been envious about Seattle over the last few decades because of the growth. But with that also has come significant challenges within the city because the city has not been growing affordably. We have significant amount of people on the streets and homeless. A lot of causes for homelessness are sort of very complex, but affordability is one significant component of that as well. We've experienced almost 47% rent increase just in 5 years between 2015 to 2020. Just a couple of years ago, Zillow estimated within the Seattle area, just a 2% increase in rent could produce almost 33 people to become homeless, most of them working homeless. So that has a significant impact in terms of the growth, whether we grow affordably or not. We haven't been growing equitably as well during that period. The chart that is in front of you is that of the central area neighborhood in Seattle. It's known for its African-American population. I'll talk about that later, primarily because those are the only areas that they were allowed to live in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. It had a significant cultural and economic activity around the African-American population until recently. In 1970, 73% of the population within our central area were African Americans. Today, that number is less than 14%. And most of it, since in the last 20 years, significant amount of displacement of our African American population here. So the city has not been and is not growing equitably. And just like many cities around the country, where we're learning more and more, the legacy of racism has a significant impact on the city's pattern today. Decisions from the 20s, 30s, 40s actually is impacting us in terms of how our land is used, but also the economic well-being, the social well-being, health well-being of primarily our people of color, marginalized communities. And just like other cities, the city has a dark history, both private and public driven redlining of cities. The map you see on the right is from the 1930s. This is a map that is used by the private sector and in some cases the public sector as well to gauge desirability of areas. So what you see in blue are generally the areas considered very desirable for lending, for economic activity. And as you go to yellow and then red being the worst, where banks would not lend you money if you lived in those areas. And if you see right in the middle where it says D5, those are the areas, the central area. That's where African Americans could only live in those areas, in part also because of very specific racial covenants in the neighborhoods like Capitol here, Ballard. Most of the blue areas actually restricted any non-white, whether it's Asian, African, or other immigrants, that they can't, by written covenants, they cannot own property in those areas or live in that area, in those areas. And that was going on all through the 50s and some in the early 60s. So because of that, most of our marginalized communities and people of color are relegated to the areas that you see in red, yellow on the map. As I mentioned earlier, while we no longer have those legal segregations, those historical legacies are still with us, and we see it in our data. We see it in everyday in the neighborhoods physically, and in the economic disparities that you see in those areas as well. This is a map. Just about 5 years ago, we were mapping the population distribution within Seattle. So what you see darker blue are most of the basically white neighborhoods, the higher desirable areas. And in orange and reddish color are where most of our people of color actually live today. And that directly correlates to existing conditions around lack of access to opportunity in terms of infrastructure, schools, jobs, but also lack of higher risk of displacement. So going back to the middle, the central area that you see in the center, it's close to downtown. Because of the economic boom now, it has become a very desirable area for people who want to bike, take transit, and they are getting displaced from those areas because of that, because you can go to downtown quickly. Recently, a couple of years ago, most of you, if you're in this profession, have seen The Color of Law or have read it by Richard Rothstein. He documents in no uncertain terms with facts from, in the last 50 to 70 years, how our current segregation pattern, to quote him, is not the unintended consequence of individual choices and of otherwise well-meaning law or regulations, but of unhidden public policy that explicitly segregated every metropolitan area in the United States. Every city around the country is affected by that, and we see that today. So now I'll talk about how the city manages growth, and then walk you through the sort of the regulatory context by which we address a lot of the economic, but most importantly, the land use policy issues. So Seattle's comprehensive plan, which I'll come down to at the lower level and the bottom there, is actually a required document by a state law. The State Growth Management Act, which was adopted in 1990, required every municipality in the state of Washington to have a comprehensive plan with a goal of reducing sprawl primarily and protecting the environment. It is a tool for funding infrastructure such as transportation. If you don't have the comprehensive plan, if you don't update it regularly, you risk getting state and sometimes federal funding for transportation as well. But it also allocates housing needs as well as job needs. So the cities have to respond through their zoning and enabling mechanisms to address targeted housing for those areas. That at the higher level, the State sort of Management Act has some regulatory designations. And then you come down to the region, what's called the Puget Sound Regional Council. These are 4 major counties. King County, which Seattle is located, is one of them. So the Puget Sound Regional Council prepares a multi-county planning policies and also develops the vision for the area, the next 20-year vision every 10 years or so. And currently they are updating the updated vision 2050. Actually, they're finalizing that. And the city has to be consistent with that. Puget Sound Regional Council also certifies our local plans. So to make sure that it is consistent with the regional plan, it is consistent with the State Management Act, and consistency with the vision is a critical component of that requirement. And then at the local level, at King County, which Seattle, Tacoma, and Bellevue, these 3 cities are located, there is a planning council, which adopts the countywide planning policies, but also sets up what are called urban growth boundaries, areas that are designated for a higher density or zoning or development. And then it also allocates the targets, what I mentioned, for housing and jobs within that area. And then you come down to the ground within Seattle itself, then the Seattle and every municipality prepares a comprehensive plan that has to reflect its own local priorities, but also consistent, going back up in terms of scale back to the state. I'll talk briefly about what the Seattle Comprehensive Plan does. So it is a 20-year growth projection, and it's always focused on the next 20 years. The first one was established in 1994, but it has a state required elements. What you see on the list, there are 8 of them: land use, housing, transportation, capital facilities, utilities, economy, environment, parks, and rec. Each one of those have multiple policies and objectives, some of them that are required, some of them recommendations. The land use component of it is pretty extensive, including designations of the types of land uses, what's called a future land use map. So it provides the map where industry, housing, as well as urban centers and what are called villages are located. You can see that reflected on the map on the right in green. What is cross-hatched are the highest densities allocated as urban centers. We have 3 of them, one in downtown in the center, University District, just north, and then further north, Northgate. These are the highest concentrations of areas because of infrastructure, transportation, also the highest density areas. And then you have urban villages, which are sort of the next tier. Again, those are on major transportation corridors or intersections or transit centers. So they have relatively, again, higher density designation within those areas. Over the last 25 years, from the first comprehensive plan, the city's growth has taken place in 18% of the land. Actually now close to 80% of the projected growth is concentrated on those 18% of the land, what you see in green. And that is, compact development. It's higher density, and it leaves out significant amount of land for other uses, mostly industrial, and certainly significant amount of them are single family. We're working through now actually introducing different housing types and maximizing the utility of that gray area that you see to maximize opportunities for housing. Our last comprehensive plan was updated in 2016. The state requires each municipality to update its comprehensive plan every 5 to 8 years. It's a state required action. So we are currently in the process of scoping work and ideas around the next update, which will be due in 2024. But the 2035, Seattle 2035, it took about 3 to 4 years to develop. It was completed at the end of 2015. In that process, you don't update every component or every element of the comprehensive plan. Through community engagement and current context, you identify the key areas that need to be updated. So in the 2035 plan, housing affordability was key, social equity, and environmental sustainability and livability were the key elements. So that comprehensive plan addresses those in multiple ways in policies and recommended changes, and then it gets adopted as part of the city's 20,000-foot level policy objectives and regulations. Then once you have that comprehensive plan, there are a number of ways and mechanisms that then brings that down to the neighborhood level and to implement the objectives and visions of the comprehensive plan. One such tool is community or neighborhood plans. These are very specific in certain neighborhoods. They have boundaries, We have over 26 neighborhood plans over the last 25 years, and we're producing new ones as well. One of the key issues at a neighborhood level plan is you'd hear this, especially when growth is taking place in cities or changes coming up. Neighborhoods and organizations, especially single-family neighborhoods, would request the city to actually update their neighborhood plan, or if they don't have one, to create one. That was a challenge for Seattle for many years, and we can't, as a city, can't update every single neighborhood for 27, 28 community plans all the time. So we put in the comprehensive plan a guide by which how you prioritize which areas to plan. So some of the highlights in terms of for us to determine how and where to plan are areas that are designated for urban centers of villages. These are the ones that I talked about in the green previously. And sometimes new designations come up that in the future, this area will become an urban village. Then you have to plan for that ahead of time. So that becomes one priority. Areas that have high risk of displacement, such as the central area that I talked about, or areas that have low access to opportunity. This is trying to address equity issues. Significant capital improvements or investments that are planned, parks, utilities, and others. Anticipated high growth areas, or environmental justice concerns, like the Duwamish land in the southern part of Seattle is an important area from a climate justice perspective. So the comprehensive plan gives us a roadway in terms of how we need to prioritize as a city. And then staff within an Office of Planning, Community Development, and working with other departments, my office in the last few years after the comprehensive plan was developed, actually wanted to make it more accessible in terms of getting data-informed decisions for the mayor and council and departments in terms of how to prioritize. So what you see on the map on the right is a heat map of prioritization for planning purposes, for community planning. So the greener area is, the orange area is sort of the highest priorities in terms of where we need to plan. And I'll talk now just quickly in terms of how we come up with that data. So this is a compilation of multiple indices. So there are three primary ones, but the first one is growth. So we look at four indices for growth. So areas that are experiencing recent growth, from pattern of development, where there's a recent transit expansion or are planned in the future, urban village expansion areas, which I talked about earlier, and then capital investments there are known capital investments around parks and utilities. So each of those areas are staff maps that in GIS, and then combining those four indices create a map that you see to the right, which gives you a heat map from just growth perspective. So the yellow-orange area are the highest priorities if you're just looking at growth as a criteria, and the green areas are the least priority. The second one is equity. And then for this, we use three specific indices. One is displacement risk and concentration of marginalized populations. So if you remember the earlier maps that I showed you, that then tracks to where you see orange area, that's where most of our marginalized populations live. Those are areas that have a high risk of displacement. And those are also the areas that have low access to opportunity and environmental justice as well. Then that is planned from an equity perspective. We have a map, a heat map, to use to be data informed in our decisions. And then the third one is about density. Where are the population concentrations? Where are the jobs? And where are the significant amount of housing units? So that has its own heat map. And then we take all those three and combine to come up with the earlier map that I showed you as overall community planning priority areas. Based on this map, now we are conducting about 3 or 4 community plans that are some we're finishing, some we're starting, but almost all of them are in those orange or red areas. So when community groups come to you and ask, hey, I want a neighborhood plan done for my area, well, you really don't need it compared to the orange area. So it is also a communication tool with the public. So when you do community plans, what are the outcomes? And they're different depending on the context of where you are. They're very specific to the neighborhood. They really address neighborhood concerns through engaging with community groups. And then you craft tailored zoning, code changes, design standards, including urban design regulations, height, bulk, street character, public spaces. But it also addresses very specific programs around infrastructure integration, types of housing that is appropriate for that area, economic development opportunities, but it's very targeted to very specific areas. So those are community plans that then become a tool for implementing the comprehensive plan at the ground. And then you have other programs of increment other than just land use, such as zoning. Mandatory housing affordability is one of them, equitable development initiative, and outside citywide. These are very 3 specific programs and policies, and I'll talk about them quickly. So as I mentioned in the 2035 comp plan, housing affordability is one of the priorities that the comp plan identified. So over the last 3 years, we've done a significant amount of work, one of the most transformative zoning changes in the city to address the need for capacity within citywide, to address our housing needs, but also to put, for the first time in Seattle's history, a mandatory requirement for affordable housing. So historically, Seattle, until about 3 years ago, has had only an incentive-based voluntary program. So what you see in teal color in the center, which is mostly downtown, those are 90% of the areas where you can get an incentive. The incentives are generally zoning capacity. If the site is zoned for 20 stories, you can go to 25 stories if you include affordable housing or pay in lieu fees. Unfortunately, over the years, those were not that successful because the process is extensive. Developers will choose to actually build by right, whatever is allowed, rather than take the additional capacity and be able to provide affordable housing. So what we've done is, through a 4-year process, we actually rezoned a significant amount of the city, what you see on the right. All of the urban villages and urban centers, and about 6% of our single-family neighborhoods to higher capacity relative to its context. The purpose of that is in order to capture affordable housing through a requirement, making it mandatory, we have to give value. And the only way we can give value primarily is through capacity. So it was one of the most contentious processes in the city's history, but at the end of the day, each area, when it was rezoned through an extensive public process, it was approved unanimously each step of the way. So all of that area that you see now, for any development of commercial or residential development at different rates, developers are required to either pay in lieu fee or for the city to use that money and leverage it for other investments for affordable housing, or include affordable housing on their sites. So that is the first major transformation for the city, for the first time, to be able to make it mandatory for affordable housing program. In New York, affordability is an issue, obviously, but and requirements exist there as mandatory in certain areas. So, and then the city uses those to really advance its equity goals around affordability issues. The other is the comprehensive plan addressed, equity is an important component. Social equity, racial equity is an important component. One of the tools we used to implement that is soon after the comprehensive plan was adopted, my office developed the Equitable Development Implementation Plan. This again brings it from that 20,000 foot level to very specific programs and recommendations focused on, in this case, expanding the benefits of growth to the marginalized communities, to address displacement issues, address local cultures and unique characteristics of immigrant communities and people of color communities, and then focused on empowering wealth building, not just affordable housing, but to make sure that the people that are most impacted can actually participate in the economic growth by ownership, through ownership. So the Equitable Development Implementation Program that my office administers, I'm still working there for a few months, so I can call it my office. So has over time captured permanent funding, and to date in the last 4 years we've funded about $36 million directly to community initiated programs and projects that are coming from those mapped areas that I talked about. These are, we use again data for that. As part of the comprehensive plan, this is one of the maps that we developed around equity index mapping. We looked at displacement indices in the city and identified a heat map. The reddish area, in this case from a displacement risk index perspective, are the areas that are at high risk of displacement. Again, the middle area, the central area is a good example, but there's a significant amount of them along Rainier Beach and all the way south. So that becomes a criteria for us if you want to come to the city to apply for a project, a place-based project. If you come from those boundaries, then we can fund your program in a competitive process. Similar map like that is an index map that looks at access to opportunity. Which areas have less access for education, economic opportunity, transit access, civic infrastructure. And all of those indices feed into this index map, and that becomes a heat map. So our decisions are, as best as can be, data informed. And so we would say, if you come from those areas and propose a project, then through a competitive process, you get funded. Now we're working through almost 60 local people of color organizations of all sizes, some 40 or plus that we've funded from capacity building to actually ownership of properties for developments. And we work with them continuously in terms of for them to come up with the kind of place they want to be or they want to build, whether it's affordable housing or childcare. We've leveraged over $100 million through that Equitable Development Initiative program from our other sister departments to actually achieve this. And this is growing more and more as one of the most successful programs in the city. And then the other is around climate justice and livability issues. So one of the initiatives my office has been developing, working with parks and other departments, sustainability, Office of Sustainability, is to really think about the importance of public spaces. It is more apparent now through the pandemic, and social environmental justice really goes hand in hand with access to public space. It hasn't been more stark as it has in the last year, how important public space is, but the way we frame it is also primarily from an equity lens, that we need to improve our public spaces, but we need to make them accessible as well. Similar to all other sort of land use decisions, we then develop sort of data-informed way to address that. And this is a map similar to the other ones, but very specifically focuses on disparities around public spaces. So we look at data around access, which parts are accessible or not accessible to especially communities of color. You may have a beautiful park, but if you can't get to it, it's useless. Or if there are barriers, it's useless. So we take data around access, health outcomes, race and social equity, growth and density, and then come up with a heat map that then directs the city and our parks department and multiple agencies that actually own properties. The city owns its own municipality. electricity, its own electricity, municipal electricity, but they own significant amount of land. So does public utilities. So we coordinate with publicly owned lands of different types to make sure that we achieve our equity goals through a data-informed process. I'd encourage people to see we have an interactive map for this as well. The public can engage as well and click at their own neighborhoods and see how that rates from an equity or health or other indices. And they can also give us feedback in terms of what needs to be improved. I know that's a lot of information, but I just wanted to give you sort of a large context of how the city manages its growth in this specific areas in the comprehensive plan. So I will end there and happy to.
Thank you so much for that, Sam. It's actually really super fascinating to learn about Seattle's kind of really data-centered approach to determining where to cite new growth. I'd love to kind of shift our conversation with our respondents. I'd love to invite our three respondents to join us on screen. All three of them served as advisors throughout the development of our 21 Visions platform. I'd like to invite Annie Levers, who has kind of such rich knowledge of city government and planning policy, Moses Gates, Vice President for Housing and Neighborhood Planning at the Regional Plan Association, and Beatrice Sibley's Managing Partner at BOS Development. Also a board member at the forum and chair of the Shapeshift Committee, Beatrice has been so incredibly supportive and helpful throughout the entire process, as well as all our fellows. I'm so glad the three of you can join us in our discussion today. So I have a couple of quick questions to start off our discussion, and then I'd love to open it up to our respondents, who I'm sure have a ton of kind of great questions and comments to ground us in some of the challenges that we're facing in New York City. So kind of easy, quick question, but big one. This past year, throughout COVID, we've seen why planning and design truly matter, whether it's been kind of overcrowding that we've noticed, obviously to kind of a limited supply of affordable homes, which thus kind of accelerated COVID transmission in especially underinvested neighborhoods. At least we've seen that in New York City. Poor access to parks, making it more challenging to kind of find respite and keep socially distanced. How has kind of the perspective from the past year changed the way you think about cities and kind of planning moving forward?
So in Seattle specifically, huh?
And as a planning practitioner, kind of with such rich knowledge and expertise from all over the country. But yeah, maybe in Seattle.
Well, so it is a rude awakening, for lack of a better phrase. Well, one of the challenges that we saw right from the beginning, when the pandemic started, the first case was here, was the issue relevant to quarantine and people staying at home. And one of the earliest changes that we made is the importance of public space and public right-of-ways, that we need to actually quickly open up certain neighborhoods and using equity map so that people have access to those public spaces. Over, I forgot now, close to 18 miles of public streets are now dedicated for, and some of them actually permanently becoming public spaces. We've also looked at the importance of the analysis that we've been doing about public spaces previously and how that now is helping inform our conversation with our parks department to make sure that in coordination with transportation, we have an equitable recovery, especially for small businesses. I'm sorry, can you hear me? Restaurants and others to be able to take advantage of our public right-of-way. So health, public space is probably the most important. The other is a lot of the equity issues that I talked about that we know has been there historically, has been highlighted even significantly more because the people who are most impacted from the pandemic have been people of color and the same people that live in those geographic areas that I showed. So the mayor and council this year have committed $100 million just specifically to Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities to help in the recovery part of the pandemic, as well as a number of focus around small businesses. But in the longer term, it is very important that we really think about what this means for cities. Every city throughout history that has become a great city or has transformed, it is because of major disasters, whether it's fire, earthquake, or pandemic. So this is a once in a generation, once in a 100-year opportunity for cities and land use planners and mayors and decision makers to really think not just outside the box, but outside a different kind of box in terms of what we think about, the future of our cities ought to be.
For that, Sam. I have one more quick question, then I'll pass it to our respondents. I want to point at some of the earlier maps that you showed in your presentation, especially those redlining maps in Seattle. I see in some way the Equitable Development Initiative kind of moving toward an approach that almost repairs the legacy of bad planning policy, specifically redlining and highway construction. So I'm wondering, we have a lot of fellows and kind of planners joining us. How can planners move toward kind of a reparative planning process that kind of really ensures racial justice in the built environment? It's a big question, but I'm just kind of curious to know if you've been thinking about that specifically, especially in this past year.
Sure. I think it's even more important now than before. It's not, and we've learned in more and more the color of law I mentioned, I think first it's just educate ourselves. We don't know our past, we don't know our future in land use planning. That's why it's important to acknowledge, even native and indigenous engagement. So for me, there's two things. One is just educating ourselves and the constituents that we work with. Repairing that wound really comes to the tools and the expertise that we have from a land use perspective. So for example, to give you an example, we're doubling down instead of just transit-oriented developments that we typically as planners think about, to really think about what does an equitable transit-oriented development look like. So we have a work plan now, as we have about 14 new stations that are going to come here because of a major transit improvements in the region. So we're going to look at those from a race and social justice lens as we rezone those areas. Can we have properties there that we can actually secure so that they are owned by people of color? Are there zoning barriers that specifically impact people of color from land ownership or land development? So we're going to look at it from an equitable transit-oriented development or equitable zoning perspective, and have those race and social justice lens in the decisions that planners and designers make. And the other is, you got to engage the people who are most impacted. We're really usually good at thinking that we know what's good in it. I myself have done that in the past, but you'd be surprised when you hear directly from the communities that are being impacted.
Terrific. Well, Beatrice, I kind of want to open it up to you. You've provided such really helpful perspective throughout the whole process, kind of through a lens of both having participated in community boards, as well as kind of sharing really important kind of economic perspective, both working community and real estate development. From these perspectives, I'm curious if you can kind of lay out some of the challenges that we're facing in New York City with our planning and development process, and if you have any specific questions for Sam that might kind of help us work through those the challenges or hurdles.
Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you, Guillermo. And Sam, just so inspired by the leadership you've taken personally and your planning department in really thinking about innovative ways forward. One of the challenges that we have, if you talk to me for 3 minutes, you'll hear me say, I live in Harlem, is the space of the public footprint has been diminished. When Harlem began its last cycle of revitalization, a significant amount of the real estate in Harlem was actually held by the city in rem, from tax foreclosures. Now that is pretty much worn off. And so the space that the public has to act is in the public realm and possibly, but significantly, in the stock of public housing, NYCHA being a significant holding of real estate. And so just wanted to talk about, how do you engage in the public planning process in markets where the private sector controls the development rights? Most of those development rights are as of right, When there is in fact a public decision required, recently we had to deal with a major rezoning of a residential mega property. That was very difficult because when the few private sites require a public action, then all the public interests weigh in on that single private property. Talking about Lenox Terrace in Harlem. So just thinking about how, yes, it's great, sorry to be slow in getting there, but it is great that we have come to a public awakening of the need for equity. But that public awakening in cities such as New York are an environment where the public ownership of development space is quite limited.
That is one of the biggest challenges on almost every city. And one of the big mistakes most cities have done over time is actually letting go of their public properties without enough return in terms of addressing some of the biggest challenges that we're talking about now from an equity perspective. So from my perspective, there are two things. One, the city has, municipalities have two levers. One is regulatory, the other is if they own the properties themselves. So on the regulatory levers, it is really important that as much as, and of course, by right, it is difficult, but you have to elevate the biggest challenges that the city is facing. In this case, whether it's affordability, I think we need to go beyond affordability. It's more about ownership. If anything, the color of law points out is that in part that the income disparities or wealth disparities are directly associated to lack of ownership of people of color, especially. So if there are any levers, either through incentives or other ways within the private land, to be able to advance either wealth building, ownership, or participation as part of becoming developers. On the other one, which is public lands, we have been doing a lot of work here, recognizing that not only that we equitably actually let go of our city-owned properties, and through the current mayor's direction, we've actually worked on transferring 3 major properties, one in the central area that I talked about, that were community owned, but they were just basically leasing it, and nonprofit organizations that are advancing a lot of the equity goals that we talk about in policy, but they've been doing it for 20, 30 years. We transferred 3 major properties directly to these nonprofit organizations. And we are working on several others now, in that when we let go of public land, it should be very much focused on the most need rather than just the highest bidder. The second part of that related to that is we started putting, and we sold a city property about 2 years ago, significant land within the downtown area, and took that money and created a fund for strategic land or strategic investment. We put together a committee for people coming from those geographic areas that I showed you on the heat map, for them to advise us how that money should be spent to purchase property for a very specific reason of ownership. It could be land, it could be buildings in very specific areas. So that program is going to expand in one form or another. The third related to that, the 14 station areas that I talked about. So we're working with the state as every opportunity we get, especially through our Office of Housing, to acquire state land. The state now allows us, if you dedicate it for affordable housing, you can get it for basically for $1. But take that and not just build affordable housing. Make sure that it is a mixed development that gives opportunities for retail on the ground floor or commercial activity on the ground floor, but for the pure purpose of have ownership for people who haven't been able to own land or property, not just rent or low rent structure. So for me, those are the 2 levers that the city has, but we need to double down, especially on public land, public access, public properties that we have, including working with our infrastructure departments. For example, any surplus land that they have should be directed very much within this, what I talked about, race and social justice lens to address those issues. That should be the role of government, because, and that's a way you can, hopefully repair, in some cases, it looks like an irreparable wound from the last, 100 years. But we have to double down on those. What the New York version ought to be, it has to work obviously within that culture and regulatory framework. But the North Star, the main objective has to be really clear and repeatedly spoken about and bought into. This is where we want to get to, and figure out how we get there. So, and the private sector is really important in that conversation as well. So if there is a housing development, don't have the affordable housing developers just think about affordable housing. Can portion of it be actually for ownership that with participation for people most impacted as part of that development? And we're doing one up north in Northgate, for example, with our state housing, Seattle Housing Authority, which is a separate state agency. And then we have an Office of Housing, which is a local agency. And the three and private entities are working together to have a greater whole that is mixed. Ownership is important, as well as affordable rent.
Just a quick clarification, then I'll recede. But so much of our federal housing subsidy through the low-income housing tax credit has been targeted to rental. Yeah. I don't think it's foreboding for it to be used towards ownership, but in markets such as New York, it has predominantly been used for rental. How did you get around that in Seattle?
That would be, so we're having discussions with our Office of Housing, which administers that, in terms of what are the ways within the legal framework we can actually stretch that within resources that could double up with Office of Housing. So most of our fund comes for the local housing, affordable housing program through levies. And Seattle has been generous over the years. The last one over, I believe, $300 million levy that goes to the Office of Housing. So using the leverage that Office of Housing has with the low income tax credit in combination with the private development to advance ownership, not only ownership, but 3 bedrooms and larger units for families, but also looking at ways that we can go up in terms of the AMI, area median income, which the low income tax credit limits you up to, I believe, 80%. And can we go above that? Because most people, even in the 100 and 110% of area median income, are the most impacted in many ways. So we're looking at creative ways to actually move the goalposts in terms of access to those resources by combining them with multiple sources and the leverage that we have from a zoning perspective. So there's a lot of information in our Office of Housing site, who they engage in those conversations, but as a city, we're having that conversation at multiple fronts as well.
Thanks for those questions, Beatrice. Annie, I'd love to turn it to you. I wonder if you can kind of help us tease out some of the challenges that we're facing here, especially kind of with issues on fair share housing policy or fair share policy in general that we've kind of discussed in some of our working groups. We've had many long-term plans in New York, Plan NYC, One NYC, but some may argue that there is enough long-term planning. I know you spent some time looking at Seattle's comp plan process. I'd love to kind of open it up to you with any initial questions or responses from Sam's presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sam. I just really want to thank you for being here and for your presentation. I have a million questions that I want to ask you, but I will limit it in this moment. I mean, what's clear to me is that we are just so far behind the curve of where we could be based on what you just presented. And obviously there's a lot that we could learn from just the simple just producing the analyses that you have. I think would make a huge difference in New York City, because there is this overwhelming sense and evidence, honestly, that we have no rationale for our planning and policy decisions in New York City, and that for the most part, when it comes to especially rezonings, there is the sense that communities of color in recent years have been targeted for upzonings because it is sort of the path of least resistance to achieve political goals, without really rooting that in this sort of objective analysis of equity. And that, you know, in order to get the sorts of infrastructure investments that communities have been calling for decades, they need to accept a lot more growth in their neighborhood. And there is a feeling of sort of like, why us and not them? Why are we the ones being picked on? And I think you see that in a lot of our, not just land use decisions. I think that flows into all our city's operations, that there is this sort of sense that we're taking the path of least resistance. You even see it in our open streets program. The whole program is framed around where there are community organizations that are willing to run the open street, or where there are volunteers available to staff that street, which tends to be whiter, wealthier areas that have more flexibility. So it's, you know, there are these problems leach through all our city's operations, and as a result, there's a fundamental lack of trust. And I think a lot of that is rooted in the sort of politics of what we're dealing with. I think all of it is going to be political, and there are going to be hard fights. But you know, this isn't dating back to redlining. This is fresh for New Yorkers. This is happening right now, you know, and it's continuing to happen. And so, you know, I think I'm very aware that, you know, while there is a lot that we could just do, you know, objectively with our data to sort of center that approach, that wouldn't do it, I think, here. I think there would be a lot of mistrust and distrust still of just even those analyses, let alone what you do with them. So I guess my question to you is sort of where and how were you able to build trust with communities? And maybe an even more interesting question is, where were you not able to do that, and what did you learn from that experience? Because I think we're gonna inevitably face a lot of that in New York City. And it's just something that we need to be real about and grapple with and take as it comes, I think.
So, yeah, all of the issues that you raised, it's not unique to New York. I mean, it may look rosy in terms of a lot of the stuff that I talked about, but we have challenges with that as well, depending on specific areas. So and I keep talking about the central area, and I'll just do it by way of example. When we're going through the mandatory housing affordability program, which required by state law, we have to give equal value to be able to extract, you know, affordable housing. But for increasing capacity, we would not be able to actually achieve that. So one of the biggest challenges were in two very starkly different areas. One is very affluent white neighborhood, very progressive. They have poster Black Lives Matter and then no affordable housing together in their front yards, because this affordable housing program was seen as, oh, it's going to bring the wrong people. So we're fighting that fight there. In the central area, the concern was the 14% that I talked about. By increasing property zoning there, you're actually creating displacement, was what they felt. And some of, especially the older residents who owned homes and they're getting offers, lots of cash, and they don't want to leave. They don't want to leave their community. So there was a lot of engagement, and we learned from it as well. And what we learned was, even though that you're trying to address their affordability issues for people within that area, your very action is actually going to create displacement. And that's what came across within that area. So we needed to make a number of tweaks within the regulatory program, including looking at ways to actually create a different kind of loan, remove some of the barriers if you are, and we're looking at currently in that area, if you are a legacy resident, you know, African-American, who owned property there for many years within the legal bounds. We want to look at ways to actually minimize the impact of the capacity increase, and then engage them to be able to actually be developers themselves. So we are looking at regulatory barriers that we can remove. We're looking at the captured value of from the increase could actually go back and very specifically invested in that area. And we did it in the Chinatown International District as well. It's kind of similar issues that came up, in that you need to mitigate the impacts of well-intentioned zoning. And we always go through this process, as well as we're intending that capacity increase to be. We need to understand what the direct impacts are. So to give you an example, we had a group that we were working with, an architect who's helping them, did a year of analysis trying to, for those Black developers to be able to develop in those areas. Well, our own requirements for affordable housing fee and process was a barrier for those developers to do it. Because of that, now we're working with Department of Construction, my office, and Office of Housing to figure out how we mitigate that so that they could be owners as well. So there are multiple challenges whenever you do a land use decision. The key is to make sure that we have a race and social justice toolkit for every policy that we put in place, that it has to go through that process. In other words, you always check to make sure that what the race impact of that decision is on people of color. And then you have to mitigate those choices. So we're going through that process as we speak. We just developed accessory dwelling units primarily because of that, removed significant amount of the barriers, including looking at free design, pre-approved design. We have about 10 of them. And that came out of conversations with the African-American community in the Central District. Some of them want to build another unit and rent their house for income. So we're making it easier for them to actually add a unit and cheaper to do it. So it's an iterative process. Another example, infrastructure improvement in the Duwamish Valley area, which is the southern part of the city. My office and Office of Sustainability led a process that started about 5 years ago to really address health impacts of significant amount of pollutants and sea level rise in that area. Most of the people who live there are people of color, immigrants, and we needed to improve the quality of the place, create a park, access to the water, because the water is going to be cleaned up, or the river. Well, right from the beginning, we realized from a race and social justice lens, if the city is going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in that area to clean it up, tomorrow that area is going to be attractive. People are going to, the same people that we're trying to help are going to be displaced. So what we did is we started putting the mitigation up front, working with Office of Housing and other resources to make sure we actually purchase property first, so that the people who live there have actually ownership ahead of time. We're working with our parks department and public utilities that have excess land to see if we can combine that for community ownership within that area. There's community groups that could actually stay there and take the benefit of the improvements. We have a city-owned community center there that we are in the process of planning to actually transfer for those organizations in South Park, in this neighborhood. So all of that came about from the initial process of making sure that you have that race and social justice lens in your policy decisions. But it's not easy. I mean, it happens here as well. We had challenges during the pandemic when we were opening up streets. We said, hey, we want to open this up for bikes and peds. A lot of the neighborhood groups who were there, they work, far away, they drive, and they were not supportive of that. So we needed to make sure that we work with them in terms of the hours and the time, whether some of them should actually not be closed as a street. But from a planning perspective, design, you're thinking, oh, great public right-of-way. But the impact on those individual properties, you would not know that unless you engage them from the beginning in that conversation. I hope that kind of answers some of your question, but it is not unique to New York. It may be more intense other places. The advantage I think Seattle has is, at least at the higher level policymakers' perspective, it is bought into, and the community has bought into what I call the North Star, what it is that you want to achieve. The devil's in the details in terms of how you implement that. That's where the challenges come, and you have to be really creative how to make it happen through private-public engagement. But it is easier if you have the policy objective is bought into already. That's less of a fight that you have to fight. It's more about how do you get there. In other areas, it could be the reverse. You could have the resources, but hey, that's not what I want. Whether the mayor or council, that's not their priorities. It's really understanding what the the important levers are for the specific area and specific issues. But we do have those problems as well. It's just a different context.
Thanks for that question, Annie. I'd love to turn it to you, Moses, and kind of hear from you. I know you've been curious about how other cities can get things done. Given kind of New York's contentious landscape, I'm kind of curious if you have a specific question for Sam.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for the presentation. The thing that stood out to me the most about it was kind of that devolution of planning authority slide that you had, where everything, starts from the state and the state growth targets and a state framework. And I'm wondering if that wasn't there, because it's not here in New York, how effective would this whole process be? And, for us, a state that doesn't have it, is there, do you think we'll be able to put in place some of the processes, that you use to achieve equitable outcomes? Or are we going to be stopped by the fact that the state doesn't, really mandate it and we don't have that process set? And just kind of as a little bit of a expansion of that, does it have to be the state, or could it be, in our case, New York City? New York City is more populous than the state of Washington. So from a geography standpoint, it might work, but do you need the powers of the state to make it work, which we don't have here in New York City?
Yeah, it does help, but I don't think so, because at the end of the day, especially now, some of the challenges with the state, sort of the top down in some way, is it gives you the framework and it forces you because you have to do it, and it is helpful. It is also cumbersome in terms of the time it takes you to get there, right? So it comes in two ways. It is really helpful in helping achieve your zoning goals in terms of opposition that you may get. You have to do environmental analysis, and it is used again and again by lawsuits, which delays the process. But while it helps in many ways, I think at the end of the day, it has to be both approaches. Local initiatives that have nothing to do with the state could actually achieve that goal as well. Chicago is a good example in many ways from that perspective. It doesn't have, the city that created a modern time comprehensive plan with Burnham's 1909 plan actually does not have a comprehensive plan, and it hasn't had for many, many years. It is done through each aldermanic district, from one aldermanic district to another. It is a contrast in terms of one area requires affordable housing, the other one, absolutely, they don't want any affordable housing. So that local decision within those areas, some are significantly successful in addressing the design, quality of place, affordability, while right next door, that is not possible. I give that example to say that the local initiatives are just as critical, and some of the most important, I think, in my experience, is that being able to actually demonstrate small things done well have a big impact on getting a larger buy-in versus, starting with this high-level 20-year vision, and which takes you about 5-6 years, and sometimes 10 years to get it to the ground. If there are ways in which compelling ideas could actually be implemented, or for us here, even in Seattle, and some of the incredible mixed private-public mixed projects that were implemented were catalysts for any number of others that we had less resistance, and regardless of the state policies, within even that state policies, implementation is one of the most difficult part of the whole process, especially when it involves funding and regulation. But I think doing it locally, compelling ideas, getting enough constituents to actually make an impact that is visible is, I learned that from Chicago and Mayor Daley. He had no patience for, a 5-year plan. Let's do something that is compelling, then everything else would follow. So I think equally can be, especially if New York can do it, I don't know, who else can, but I think the local initiatives and advocacy as yourselves and getting constituents is really, really important. Obviously, generally you work on big state policy issues that need to be in place. California has been taking, bold steps. Minneapolis has been taking bold steps around single family zoning. Those help. We have taken advantage of one. For example, the state allowed any religious properties to be upzoned even if they are in single family neighborhoods. Well, in the central area, most of those properties are owned by African-American clergies and churches and immigrant churches. Well, we just are finalizing a rezoning and capacity for that area very specifically to address those institutions not be displaced, but have a capacity and an opportunity to actually develop their properties. So to me, it goes both ways. You don't need to wait for the state to change. That's a long process. I think local initiatives are in some ways more powerful because they're very relevant and they're very easily understood because they address the very immediate issue. But none of this is easy. It just requires sort of diligent engagement and education.
Thanks for that question, Moses. I have one quick question, and then I think we're going to try to bring in a couple of our fellows and unmute them to ask some questions. I have a question, I think specifically on a challenge that I've kind of heard from kind of numerous people is the challenge around kind of interagency coordination, kind of around growth. In Seattle, you manage kind of many initiatives under the purview of the Office of Planning and Community Development. So community engagement, the comp plan, I believe also the capital budget. How has that centralized process kind of benefited the city's ability to kind of balance citywide goals, but also neighborhood kind of visions?
So we have a separate department of neighborhoods that is primarily responsible for all of our engagement, but we collaborate. When the Office of Planning and Community Development was first created in 2015, and then I was the first director, one of the objectives of the mayor at the time who created that was, in addition to addressing equity and growth in a more sort of coordinated way, is to really think about how our infrastructure, investments and planning policies are better coordinated. In other words, there were a lot of not so much silo thinking, but silo implementation of infrastructure because the Department of Transportation has its funds and timeline tied to its source of funding, whether it's federal or state. Parks has a different source of fund. Their timeline for implementation of a park is different from the transportation in the same exact area where you have a park developed. Well, the sidewalk is not going to be done for the next 15 years because it's not in their timeline. So one of the things that we created right from the beginning as part of the Office of Planning and Community Development was the Capital Cabinet. So this was a mayoral initiative. Myself as head of the Office of Planning that does most of the responsible for comprehensive plan and planning, and then the city budget director helped establish that, and we chaired that group for the last almost 4.5 years. It was paused during the pandemic. We had a different structure more around the response, but through that process, it had two primary purposes. One, to make sure that the directors from these departments are constantly in contact and aware of what is coming up, either currently implemented plans or that ones that are initiated, so that they can start planning their infrastructure in time and in place, so that that coordination takes place. The second part of it is, more importantly, is really addressing more immediate issues. Some funding that could be moved from parks, and instead of doing it 5 years from now, can you do it now because there are these 2-3 opportunities? And we piloted that in this Duwamish area, Duwamish Action Plan, where there was just multiple issues there. Sea level rise, as I mentioned, utility infrastructure. Seattle Public Lights has properties and issues there. Transportation had a number of properties. So we coordinated through all of those and some of the state and port authorities to make sure that all of those are aligned for the same objective, because all of them are needed. So the capital cabinet structure helped the city organize through that structure. And then specific to each project, we engage with multiple departments. We form a charter around interdepartmental teams, and commitments are made through that process. We make sure that the team is integrated with these multiple department structures. Then they have ownership around that vision or plan or structure. So when time comes for funding, implementing, it makes it much easier. It is a difficult process. It takes a lot of upfront work, but it is also a cultural transformation for institutions. Because of the capital sub-cabinet, in term as an example, during the pandemic, we created, and the current mayor created multiple sub-cabinets, really around housing, around homelessness, around public safety, so that we have that kind of coordination. So for municipalities, one of the hardest thing is that, because of what I mentioned earlier, either sort of institutional silos or the funding mechanism and timeline gets in the way of a coordinated implementation of good development or public spaces or housing. But it is really important to have that interagency structure for coordination and collaboration as well.
Thanks, Sam. We want to bring in one question from our audience member who's a fellow of ours and a former planning director in New York City. We have Purnima Kapoor kind of joining us. Hi, Purnima. Feel free to ask your question to Sam.
Sure. Hi, Sam. So
Hi.
nice to see you.
So great to see you
It's been
too.
a while. Yes. So I see that you guys have continued to do the wonderful work that you were engaged in when we last met. And it's really impressive to see how you have used data and metrics to really paint a really compelling picture. And I think you alluded to some of the challenges in sort of agreeing on those metrics and getting to it, but the fact that you got to it is pretty impressive. I'm wondering if you have seen a shift in the way equity and just city sort of issues are getting addressed with this new approach? And have you done any work to see if in fact the new growth that is taking place is more equitable? And I'm wondering how you are measuring it, if you are sort of seeing that.
Mhm.
Great question. And it's great to see you, Purnima, again. And
Yes.
so a couple of things. I think the data approach, data-informed approach, has been extremely helpful for our internal organizations first. So let me talk about the public spaces first. So we started that process early on with 6 departments, basically, because it touches all of them. And we co-developed the idea and the concept, and a brilliant woman in my office, Casey James, actually used creative ways to actually make it easier for planning directors and staff to be able to, department directors and staff to be able to really understand what it means, so that they can actually change and improve, for example, our parks department, their own way of measuring and targeting where investments ought to go with this more sort of comprehensive approach. So that has been incredibly effective. It has also been incredibly effective how we discuss with our constituents in terms of where we're targeting investment or where we're targeting improvements around capital projects. So using that, for example, we've piloted in the South Park area, working with community groups and kids to really transform public right-of-way and streets where it's needed and why it's needed by actually putting pilot activities and projects there. Now we're working towards potential purchase of those parks so that it remains, instead of a private property, with this specific group that we're working with. And then with the most impact that we've seen in a very short time from that data approach has been the Equitable Development Initiative. We have the Ethiopian Community Center in the Rainier Beach area is now, when we started with them 5 years ago with this Equitable Development Initiative, because they come from that geographic area and they met all the requirements, they became, they were awarded initially a capacity funding, capacity building fund from the EDI or Equitable Development Initiative program. But their vision is to be developers down the road for I forgot, about 120 units or so affordable housing above their community center. But to get there, they have to have that capacity. They're becoming developers, nonprofit developers, but we funded each of the steps in the program. Now they have been awarded significant amount of resources, and they'll be breaking ground really soon to build their vision that they've had for 20 years, just because of this program. But for that, so that data that I talked about, the equity index, we have very legal restrictions. You can't choose based on color, but you can choose based on policies that we put in place saying this boundaries, these areas are, it's a policy objective with the city to address those issues. So because of that, we can say, if you come from this boundary, we can actually, you can compete for these resources. And it has been incredibly impactful in that. It has also been impactful, especially in the data that I talked about, just data informed, in helping coordinate our transportation department, Office of Economic Development, in targeting our recovery or even response during the pandemic. So we use that map to identify areas that we need to open up for small businesses, for example, outdoor spaces, and get minimize the regulations for that. Use that data. It is, it is what it is. We improve it every now and then, but it helps it takes the politics out in your conversation, either for funding, for decisions. It has been helpful for us in actually securing significant amount of funds from the federal government or state or other nonprofit organizations. We recently convened about 45 philanthropic organizations and this nonprofit local BIPOC community organizations, so that they coordinate in terms of funding. But those maps and data have been incredibly informative, again, both internally and externally, in the way we frame the issues and we talk about it for the outcome that is sought in each of the different areas. The Equitable Development Initiative, as I mentioned, we have about close to 40 projects that we have funded just in 4 years. And those transformations are taking place, and they're in different stages. Some are getting entitlement, some have started construction, like the Filipino Community Center, just specifically because of those programs.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Purnima, for that question. And I know we're out of time, so I'm just going to conclude our event today with such huge gratitude and thanks for Sam for sharing so much knowledge and expertise, both your experience in Seattle, but also your knowledge from all over the country. I also want to thank our three respondents, Beatrice, Annie, and Moses, for joining us and of course supporting us throughout this whole entire process for 21 Visions. Thank you everyone for tuning in today. Our next event is scheduled for Thursday, May 13th on inclusive and participatory design. So look out for an invite in the next few days. We'll have more events in the coming months leading up to the June primary election. In the meantime, we call on all of you watching to help us get the word out. explore our 21 visions for 2021, put it in front of those candidates. We're on a tour with 21 Visions, so please connect us to the candidates across all the races through June, mayoral, city council, borough presidents, and we're excited to be really kind of serve as a conduit for our fellows' terrific ideas. So until next time, have a great afternoon, y'all. See you soon.
Thank you all. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.